In the spring of 2023, Walter Briggs walked into a county foreclosure auction and bought 120 acres of standing water that every developer in the room had already written off as unfarmable. He paid $86,000 for the parcel, which was less than the county survey said the standing timber was worth, and the developer's man shook his head on the way out the door. The soil report called the ground hydric, poorly drained, and not suitable for cultivation, without extensive artificial drainage. The modern fix was plastic drain tile, laid by a contractor with a GPS-guided plow, and the quote for 120 acres came in at $118,000, plus a banknote Walter had no intention of signing. What he had instead was a hand-drawn drainage map from 1923, folded inside the county assessor's file, showing a clay tile system already buried under that waterlogged ground. Walter Briggs was 58 years old, and he had been farming the same 640 acres in Mercer County his grandfather had broken in the 1,940 seconds. He ran a small operation by modern standards, corn and soybeans in rotation, no hired hands through the winter. Equipment he maintained himself in a shed his father had built from salvaged bridge timber. He carried no operating debt and had never financed a piece of ground in his life, and he had watched two of his neighbors lose their farms to the bank in the last decade for exactly the reason he carried none. When a man signs the note, the bank owns the ground until the note clears, and the ground doesn't care whether the rain comes or whether the corn sets ears that year. The 120 acres he bought that morning had belonged to a man named Kunkel, who had farmed it badly for 15 years and then stopped farming it at all. It sat at the low end of the township, bordered by a county road on the west and a rail spur on the south that hadn't seen a boxcar in a decade, but still carried the right-of-way. Underneath, the soil was glacial till, the kind of ground that had once been open swamp before someone drained it a century earlier and then turned back to swamp the moment the drainage failed. The county survey described a foot of black decaying matter over several feet of rich yellow clay, with a stratum of black clay underneath that held water the way a washtub holds water. That soil profile was the reason the ground had been drained in the first place, and it was the reason the ground had gone back to water the year the drainage stopped working. The developer's man was named Ray Calder, and he worked for a regional outfit that bought ground the county called unfarmable and put up distribution warehouses on it. Calder had a clipboard and a ceiling price his boss had written down that morning in a hotel room off the interstate. He wanted the parcel because it bordered the rail spur, and rail spurs meant cheap freight, and cheap freight meant a warehouse that could service 3 states from a single loading dock. He had expected to buy it for $70,000, maybe $75,000, because nobody else bids on swamp at a foreclosure sale. Walter bid $80,000. Calder came back at $82,000. Walter went to $86,000, and that was the end of it because Calder's ceiling was $84,000, and his boss had told him not to go over it for ground that would need $100,000 of fill before a foundation crew could set foot on it. Calder closed his clipboard and walked out of the courthouse without looking back. The auctioneer read the parcel number one more time, waited the legal 10 seconds, and brought the gavel down. He signed the paper on the courthouse steps, wrote a check from the account where he kept the money from a timber sale on his own ground 2 years earlier, and drove out to the parcel that same afternoon. He walked the field in boots that filled with water before he had gone 100 yards. Cattails stood in the low spots where the laterals had once run, and a red-winged blackbird hung over the wet grass at the far edge. At the low corner where the county ditch ran along the property line, he found the collapsed end of a clay tile pipe sticking out of the bank, half buried in silt, the terracotta still intact where the ditch hadn't eaten it. He knelt in the mud and ran his thumb across the rim. The clay was smooth and hard and 100 years old, and it hadn't rotted, because terracotta doesn't rot. It breaks, it silts, it fills with root, but the fired clay outlasts the men who fired it. Walter set the piece on the tailgate of his truck and drove home with it, sitting next to the auction receipt. Walter called the regional drainage contractor in the second week of May. The contractor's name was Dwayne Erb, and he ran a tile plow with a GPS receiver and a laser-grade control that laid 4-inch corrugated plastic pipe at a consistent 3.5-foot depth across a whole field in a single pass. Erb had tiled 10,000 acres in 3 counties and had never once dug a trench by hand. He drove out to the parcel on a Tuesday, walked the wet corners in rubber boots that came up to his knees, ran a grade rod along the low side, and sat in his truck with Walter for 20 minutes doing the arithmetic on a yellow legal pad. The number came in at $118,000 for systematic tiling across 120 acres, a little under $1,000 an acre, plus a main line and a new outlet structure tied into the county ditch. Erb assumed Walter would finance the work. He said the bank would carry the note for 7 years, against the yield bump that the ground would pay for the tile inside a decade, that this was how every farmer in the county did it and had done it since the plastic tile came in during the 1,960 seconds. He talked about debt service the way a man talks about weather, as a thing a farmer plans around and lives with and never questions, because questioning it would mean questioning the whole arrangement between the farmer and the bank and the equipment dealer and the co-op. Walter told him he didn't sign notes. Erb looked at him across the truck cab for a long second, the way someone looks at a man who has just said something in a language he doesn't speak. He said the ground wouldn't drain itself. Walter said he'd think on it. Erb left the quote on the dashboard, wrote his cell number on the corner, and drove away down the county road. The neighbor was a man named Harlan Voss, 71 years old, who had farmed the quarter section to the north for 40 years and had watched the Kunkel place go wet one season at a time. Harlan had told anyone who asked that the ground was no good without the plastic and the loan, that Kunkel had gone broke trying to farm it wet, that the developers were right about the one thing that mattered. He drove his truck down the county road the afternoon after Erb's visit and pulled in at the gate. He told Walter plainly that a man Walter's age had no business digging in swamp with a shovel, that the previous owner had lost the place to the bank for exactly this kind of stubbornness, and that it was easier to pave wet ground than to drain it. Walter listened without arguing, because arguing with Harlan was a conversation that had no end. Harlan left the gate and drove back up the county road. 3 days later, Ray Calder called. He had driven past the parcel and seen Walter's truck at the gate, and he had revised his understanding of the situation. He offered $110,000 cash, a $24,000 profit in 3 weeks, no questions, no closing costs, a check inside 10 days, and he let the number sit on the line the way a man lets a number sit when he knows the other party is listening. Walter told Calder the ground wasn't for sale. Calder left his card in case Walter changed his mind. Walter put the card in the same jacket pocket where he would carry the map, and the card stayed there. He had turned down the contractor, the loan, and the developer. He had no plan yet, only a refusal, and a piece of collapsed terracotta he had pulled out of the ditch bank and set on the tailgate of his truck. The piece of clay sat on a shelf in his shop for a week while he thought about what it meant that the pipe was still there, 100 years after the man who laid it had died, still sound under the silt and the willow roots and the standing water that had covered it for a generation. If there was one section of tile still in the ditch bank, there might be more of it under the field, and if there was more of it, there might be a record of where it ran and who had put it there. Walter went to the county assessor's office on a Thursday morning and asked for the file on the Kunkel parcel. The file was thick. It ran back to the original land patent, the 1,830 seconds, through 3 owners, through 2 drainage district filings, through a foreclosure judgment, and a sheriff's sale. The clerk set the box on the counter and told Walter it was the oldest file in the cabinet. Walter sat at a table by the window and worked through it page by page while the office clock ticked and the clerk answered the phone. Halfway down the stack, he found a hand-drawn drainage map dated 1923, ink on linen, folded into a legal-sized envelope that had been stapled to a deed transfer and forgotten. The map showed a grid of clay tile lines running across the 120 acres to a main line, and the main line ran to an outlet at the low corner, the same corner where Walter had found the collapsed terracotta sticking out of the ditch bank. The map carried the name of the man who had installed the system, a farmer named August Ihele, who had bought the ground in 1919 and drained it by hand over 4 years with tile fired at a local kiln 2 miles up the road. Ihele had farmed the ground for 30 years, raised 4 children on it, and when the children left for the city after the war, the family let the place go, and the ground had been going back to water ever since. The map carried the numbers that mattered, with tile depth of 3 to 4 feet, lateral spacing of 60 feet, and a gravity slope of a fraction of a foot per 100, enough to move water without a pump, the whole system feeding downhill to the county ditch the way water has always wanted to run. Brown ink marked the lateral lines, black ink the main, and a single X marked the outlet. The system wasn't a theory or a hope. It was a plan that had already been built and had already worked for 30 years before anyone in the county owned a GPS receiver or a laser-grade control. Walter took the map to Merrill Castor, the old county drainage commissioner, a man who had been maintaining the county's ditch record since the 1972nd and who remembered the clay tile era, the way some men remember a deceased brother. Castor spread the map on his desk under a lamp and studied it for a long time before he spoke. He told Walter the old systems ran on 2 things, gravity and the small gap left between each tile section, a gap that let the groundwater seep into the pipe and run downhill through the line. The terracotta didn't rot, he said. It broke when a tree fell on it and filled with silt when a joint came apart, and the willow roots found it the way roots find any water. But the clay itself outlasted the men who fired it by generations. Castor told Walter the county's own records showed over 9,000 miles of tile drains on the 1920 census, and that most of it was still in the ground under somebody's field, forgotten, silted, and waiting. He said the men who drained the Great Black Swamp a century before, that had turned 1,500 square miles of northwest Ohio swamp into the richest cropland in the state, by digging ditches by hand and burying local clay tile. The same method, the same physics, the only difference being the scale of the ambition. The plastic industry killed the kilns in the 1960 seconds, he went on, and the men who knew the method died, and the maps ended up in boxes in county offices where nobody opened them for 50 years. Walter asked him whether a system that had been buried and abandoned for 80 years could still carry water. Castor didn't answer right away. He traced the main line on the map with his finger from the upper laterals down to the outlet, and he stopped at the X. Then he said the pipe would carry water if the lines were clear and the slope was honest. The work was finding the breaks and clearing the silt, and it wasn't new, it was old. The kind of work a man could do with a shovel and a backhoe and the patience to dig where the map told him to dig. Walter folded the map, put it in his jacket, and drove home. He had his plan. It wasn't the contractor's plan, and it wasn't the developer's plan, and it didn't require a banknote or a GPS receiver. It required him to find what was already under the ground and bring it back to life. He started at the low corner where the old outlet had collapsed into the county ditch. The main line ran 2 feet under the surface there, choked with silt and a mat of willow roots that had grown into the joints and plugged the pipe solid as a cork. Walter dug it out by hand the first day, shovel and grub hoe, down on his knees in the mud, pulling roots out of the terracotta section by section until his shoulders burned and his hands cramped. The pipe was intact where the ditch hadn't crushed it. He found the first 60 feet of main still sound, the small gaps between sections still visible, under the silt, and he cleaned each joint and reseeded the tile with a gravel pack at the gaps so the water could enter again, the way it had been built to enter a century earlier. He couldn't buy new clay tile easily. The plastic industry had closed most of the old kilns by the 1982nd, and the few still firing had switched to brick and architectural terracotta where the money was. He found one yard in the next county that still fired 4-inch clay drainage tile in small batches for restoration, work, and historic properties, and he bought 200 sections at a price that made him wince, but that was still a fraction of the contractor's $118,000. The rest he salvaged. A neighbor 2 townships over, was ripping out an old clay system to replace it with plastic, and Walter hauled away the intact sections by the truckload, cleaned them with a wire brush and a hose, and stacked them at the edge of the field under a tarp. He traced the main line up the field by opening test pits at the junctions the map had flagged, finding the lateral runs where the brown ink said they would be, marking the breaks with wooden stakes driven into the mud. Where tile was crushed or missing, he relayed. He cleaned each section, seeded it with the gap the old method required, packed the joints with washed gravel, and backfilled by hand, so the machine wouldn't crush the pipe he was trying to save. For the deep cuts, he rented a backhoe and ran it himself, learning the controls in the first hour and tearing up a fence post in the process, and he hand-dug the shallow laterals where the backhoe would have done more harm than good. The first failure came in the third week. The first 40 feet of restored main carried water for 6 days and then stopped dead, plugged by a single willow root that had grown through a cracked joint upstream and wedged itself solid over the winter. Walter cleared it with a plumber snake and a hoe handle, and he remembered what Castor had told him about the willows. He cut the hedgerow willows back from the tile path for 30 feet on either side, and he built a small cleanout at the junction the way the old commissioner had described. A vertical pipe capped at the surface so he could run a snake down the line without digging the joint up every time it plugged. The second failure came in June, and it was worse. A heavy rain hit the county, 3 inches in an afternoon, the kind of storm that used to drown this ground for a week at a time. The restored lower third held, and Walter stood at the outlet and watched the water run clear for the first time. Up the field, the upper 2/3 was still a lake, and the pressure of all that standing water blew out a junction he hadn't reinforced, a spot where the original installer had made a turn the map hadn't quite caught. Water sheeted across the surface. Again, the new gravel pack washed out in a brown wave, and the tile he had laid that morning floated up out of the trench in 2 places and rolled down the grade like loose pipe on a truck bed. He stood at the blown junction in the rain and watched his work come apart. And he didn't move for a full minute. He rebuilt the junction deeper and wider, set it on a bed of crushed stone, and he spent 3 days rereading the map against the actual grade of the field with a builder's level and a tape measure, until he found the error the original installer had made in the upper third. Ihele had run one lateral on a slope that was too flat by 2 inches in 100 feet, and in a wet year that lateral had silted and drowned the run above it, which was probably why the system had started to fail before the family even left. Walter corrected the slope on that lateral, relayed it on an honest grade, and reconnected it to the main. He worked alone through the weekdays with his son Tom on the Saturdays. Tom could get away from his own job in town, and with one hired hand, he paid in cash through the worst of the summer. At 58, his knees gave out by August, and the doctor told him he was digging himself into a hip replacement. His wife, Dot, watched from the porch of the old farmstead on the parcel, a house he hadn't yet been able to live in because the floor was soft and the well was bad, and the roof leaked in 3 places. He was spending his timber money on gravel and tile and backhoe rental and the fired clay from the yard, and the budget was climbing past what he had planned, though it was still less than a quarter of the contractor's quote, and he hadn't signed a single piece of paper at the bank. One evening in late August, Walter and Merle Castor stood at the outlet together while the sun went down behind the tree line. Water ran clear out of the pipe in the restored lower third, steady and clean, the kind of flow that meant the gaps were breathing, and the slope was honest and the gravel pack was doing its job. Castor didn't say much. He watched the water for a long while, and he pulled a plug of silt out of the outlet and rolled it between his fingers. Then he told Walter that the men who built these systems didn't expect to be remembered. They expected the ground to remember. Walter spent the winter fixing the upper third. He corrected Ihele's flat lateral, relayed the problem run on an honest grade with salvaged tile and new fired clay, and reconnected the last 3 laterals to the main, while the ground was frozen hard enough to support the backhoe. By the time the frost came out in March of 2024, the whole 120 acres was on one continuous gravity system, For the first time in 80 years, terracotta and salvage tile and new-fired clay, all running downhill to the same outlet in the county ditch, every joint packed with gravel, every willow cut back, every clean-out capped and waiting. The test came in the second week of April. A 2-day storm rolled across the county, the kind of spring rain that used to put the Kunkel place under 3 feet of water for a week at a time. It rained hard through the night and into the next morning, and the old fields around the parcel sheeted water and stood puddled in the low spots the way they always did, the ground too flat and too heavy to move that much water on its own. The county road ditch ran bank full, and the tile outlets on the neighboring fields went silent under standing water, because the water had nowhere to go. Walter's ground took it. The water enters the tile through the gravel-packed joints, seeps into the pipe the way the gaps were built to let it, and moves down the slope, foot by foot, through 80-year-old terracotta and the new relayed sections, into the main and out the outlet. The outlet runs clear and steady for the first time, in a generation, a thin, constant stream, into the county ditch that doesn't stop when the rain stops, because the ground is still draining, still giving up the water it held for a century, still doing what it was built to do. 24 hours after the storm breaks, the field is bare mud. There is no standing water anywhere on the 120 acres, and the soil at the surface is dark and workable and warm to the touch where the sun hits it. Walter crossed the field the morning after the storm, with his boots dry, for the first time since he had bought the place. He stopped at the upper lateral, the one Ikele had laid too flat, and Walter had corrected, and he knelt and put his ear to the ground the way Castor had told him an old drainer could hear whether a line was running. He heard the water moving under the soil, a low, steady sound, the sound of a system, doing what it was designed to do, a century after the man who designed it had died. Harlan Voss drives past the morning, after the storm. He stops his truck on the county road, leaves it running with the door open, and walks down to the outlet in his good boots. The old farmer stands there watching the water run clear into the ditch and doesn't say anything for a while. He asks Walter one question about the slope on the upper lateral. The one Achille had got wrong. Walter tells him the number. 2 inches of fall in 100 feet, corrected. Harlan nods once, walks back to his truck, and drives away without another word. Walter plants the field that week. Corn, the crop. August Ayakale had grown on the same ground a century earlier. The crop the previous owner had tried and failed to grow wet. Crop, the soil report had said the ground couldn't produce without extensive artificial drainage. The soil is the black decaying matter over yellow clay that the survey had called the problem, and it works the way it always worked, once the water was gone. The ground is firm enough for the planter, warm enough for the seed to germinate, and dry enough that the roots can breathe down to the tile line. None of that was true a year earlier. All of it's true now because a man dug up a map and dug out a pipe and put the water back in the ditch where it had been running before anyone alive was born. The harvest came in October. Those 120 acres yielded a real corn crop. Not a record and not a bin buster, but a real crop on ground the soil report had said wasn't suitable for cultivation. The number wasn't the point, and Walter didn't talk about the number to anyone who asked. What mattered was that the ground had produced because a man had remembered what was already under it and had done the work to bring it back. And he had done it without a banknote and without a contractor and without a GPS receiver telling him where to dig. Ray Calder came back. In November, he had driven past the field all summer, and he had watched the corn come up where he had expected cattails and standing water. Calder came to the farmstead with a new offer, lower than the last one, the way offers go, when the seller no longer needs to sell and the buyer knows it. Calder's pitch was the same, that the warehouse plan was still on the board at his office, that the rail spur was still there, that the ground was worth more paved than planted, that the numbers still worked for a distribution center if Walter would name a price. Walter didn't argue. He told Calder the ground was spoken for, and he said it the way he said everything, plainly and once. Calder left without leaving a card this time, because the card from the year before was still in Walter's jacket and had never been used. The bank moved next. That same institution that had foreclosed on the Kunkel parcel and had carried the developer's bid sent Walter a letter offering an operating line against the new ground, unsolicited, pre-approved, the kind of offer a bank extends to a man whose ground has just proven it can produce. Walter read the letter once at the kitchen table, folded it back into the envelope, and put it in the drawer with Calder's card. He didn't take the line. The bank that had written the ground off as unfarmable now wanted to lend against it, and the man who had reclaimed it without a loan didn't need one now that the ground was working. Irony wasn't stated because Walter didn't trade in irony. It was shown in the drawer and the folded letter and the field outside the window. Harlan Voss leased 40 acres of the parcel for the next season. He paid cash, counted out in $100 bills at the kitchen table, the way farmers in that county had done business for 100 years. He didn't apologize for what he had said on the county road a year and a half earlier, and Walter didn't ask him to, because the apology was in the cash and the handshake and the 40 acres. The two men walked the field together on a cold morning in December, and Harlan asked about the gravel pack at the joints, and Walter knelt down and showed him how the gap breathed and how the water found its way in. Merlecaster came out one last time before the year ended. He looked at the outlet and told Walter the county was going to note the system in the drainage record, because what Walter had restored was now the oldest continuously operating clay tile drainage system in the county, and probably in 3 counties on either side. Walter told him the men who built it deserved the record, August Ihala and the ones before him who dug the Great Black Swamp dry with shovels and local clay. Walter said he had only dug it out. Castor looked at the water running out of the pipe and said that was the whole point. Digging it out was the work. The ground already knew how to drain. Walter stood at the outlet in November, with the water running clear and the stubble field behind him, and the 1923 map in his jacket. The ground had remembered what the men who built it knew. The banknote never signed. The warehouse never built. The question is whether anyone else remembers before the next auction, or whether the next useless ground goes under concrete because nobody opened the box.